20 degrees might become the common, right? Because we're not going to have that summer flow and that cooling. So that's a very serious concern that's very real. The current modeling at the current rates of climate change have the ice fields gone by 2050 to 2060. Right? So that's now, basically, right? So that's a big issue. I think the other element we're going to see with climate change is that when you change their environment and you change their habitats, salmon respond by reducing their productivity and the number of progeny that they produce per spawner. The reason I focus on that is that directly affects people. That key element, the productivity rate from a population, determines how much fish we can remove from that population. And that's what a lot of the work in the government of Canada is about, determining that rate. Right? So if you lose that rate, then you basically are going to be losing sustainable opportunities for fishing. The other thing that we're seeing very much is real right now is much higher variability in salmon production than we've ever seen before. Really, the most recent example is in 2009, we had the poorest return of Fraser sockeye on record. That led to the famous Cohen Commission. 2010, we got the all-time record return, right? And it all happened right in the Strait of Georgia, because that's where we saw the environmental change, right outside our door. The last couple of years, though, we're seeing poor returns is in the North Pacific, right? So it's a big environment that salmon deal with. There's a lot of effects that are going to be, we could talk about ocean effects for a long time and that, but there are a lot of issues that salmon won't be able to deal with. I'm actually quite optimistic. I think that we understand these things quite well. We know what to do if we act now, but I'm not sure that we have the will to act now. So we'll probably come back to that.
Okay, yeah, I think we will. So we've heard a few things dealing with the estuary issue, for example, and some other things. In terms of managing and mitigating, do you have a prescription beyond that?
You know, ironically, we actually have a number of very good policies and legislation elements that we can use. Probably one of the most important is the 2014 BC Act for Water Sustainability. And in there is the first commitment ever to minimum ecological flows for rivers and streams in BC. It never existed, right? So you would not really respond to that until you had the rivers critically low in flow. And so you immediately take away the salmon habitat by definition. So you have that in place. We're working on the regulations right now. We have groundwater management. So that's a critically important piece of it. The wild salmon policy in the federal government has all of the components we need. So we could implement the wild salmon policy now, and it's a commitment to sustaining the genetic diversity of BC salmon and increasing the distribution of salmon in their habitats. The importance of that is we do not know how they're going to respond or how quickly they're going to respond. The only opportunity you have to really actively manage this is to increase their numbers and to sustain their habitat, which is apparently the conservative government took the habitat element out of the Fisheries Act, and now it's got to be put back in, but that looks like it's happening. So we have a lot of the critical components. It's really putting it all together. And the other part, unfortunately, is there is no choice in periods of very poor production is we have to reduce our fisheries, right? So we will have to take less. We'll have to share more with other species like the orcas that you brought up. And so it's not, in the short term, it's not looking like a really great opportunity for sustaining fisheries. But I also commented on the variability. And so we need to have more information on different populations so we can capture these big spikes that come up and down. And they're very short term. We're seeing them coastwide. This year where everybody is talking about poor returns, except in Barkley Sound, or except in Bristol Bay. Bristol Bay had an all-time record return of sockeye, 58 million plus, right? So the variability in salmon production is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
That's not an easy thing to manage, is it? Okay. Dalal, maybe we can chat with you for a little bit. Thanks. So one of the things that I know is a big interest of yours has to do with marine debris, and in particular, the issue of ghost fishing. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand ghost fishing a little bit more first, and then we can talk a bit about it.
Sure. So ghost fishing, besides having a pretty cool name, is what happens when ghost gear is lost or abandoned, and continues to fish and kill or injure marine life. So, up until 50 or 60 years ago, fishing gear was made out of natural materials like hemp or bamboo or jute that would break down over time. But then, since then, we've introduced more synthetic materials that are cheaper and more durable, like nylon and plastics, and those gears take much longer to break down. And it's really a threefold problem. So, number one, you have the direct mortality or injury to marine life. Number two, you have the economic losses, so like loss in fishery potential and yields, economic losses in terms of tourism, and then also the amount of time and money that fishers have to spend replacing their gear. And then number three is kind of a emerging problem, which is that over time these plastics break down and become microplastics, and we're learning that those microplastics are now entering the food webs, and marine life that we consume are also consuming these microplastics, so we're ingesting this kind of secondhand.
So how big of an impact are we really talking about on fisheries and wildlife?
So it's a problem that's known to be on a global scale, but it's not yet been studied on a global scale. There's one report that came out by the UN Environmental Program that estimates about 640,000 tons of gear are lost at sea each year. So it's a huge problem.
And you said it's not really being addressed as a global issue at this point. What is currently being done?
There's a couple things. So I think the most exciting one is that in the new UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's actually a standalone oceans goal, and underneath that, there's a target that has specific language about reducing marine pollution, including marine debris and ghost gear. So I think it's in the forefront of everybody's minds, but we're still kind of lacking an understanding and lacking in terms of building evidence to kind of support that this is a big impact, and very basic things like having a common language for discussing this issue. So one of the things I've been looking at is trying to estimate how much fish are killed each year from fishing gear. But what I've discovered is that one study might report gear in terms of length of nets lost, and another study might report it in terms of number of nets lost. So it's very hard to consolidate all that information and to get a global picture.
So I guess the citizen that I can do, what is it that those of us in this room can do?
I think it's one of those issues is kind of like climate change, a global commons issue that's really hard to feel like you're not contributing towards. I would say, well, I can pitch the Oceanwise Seafood Program and say, look for the Oceanwise logo, even though ghost gear isn't explicitly incorporated into the standard. Doing that in the future. You can certainly support an NGO that tries to combat ghost gear. Like locally, we have the Emerald Sea Society that does cleanups of ghost gear. You can also join the shoreline cleanup. A lot of times those gears do end up on shore. So things like that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And then, Teresa, let's shift over to you for a few minutes. I wanted to start, I think, with this question about how fisheries are managed now, the way that it's different from the way they were managed in pre-colonial times, and what the implications for managing through these changes that we're seeing, these unprecedented changes, would be.
Okay. Well, first I should explain that I did my PhD research based on the question that as an Aboriginal woman, I wanted to know how our access to resources was dismantled. What happened to our access to our salmon, to our ulakan, to all of our resources. So I spent significant amounts of reading, looking at history and historic records. And particularly I was interested in the interpretation of economy. In the past, before Canada was hatched, we had an economy that has been overlooked and minimalized, and part of the reason for that is because we were pushed out of the way. There was also another caveat at the time. They also didn't think that we were going to live. We had a very high death rate as Aboriginal people on this coast, from smallpox, from other diseases, and there just wasn't anticipated that we were going to be successful. Well, we're still here, doing well, and the fastest growing segment of the Canadian population, as a matter of fact. And the way that we managed our resources in the past was based on our social institutions. My name, Sm'hayetsk, it's something that I wear. I hold it. It's placed on me, and there are obligations to hold that name. And I belong to the House of Sm'hayetsk, Dalwatsogu, and I belong to the Gitlan tribe, and I belong to the Raven clan. So we have these different layers within our social institutions, and each one of them has obligations. And those are poorly understood by other people in general, but certainly anthropology has been trying to some extent, but has missed some of the key mechanisms of the reasons why we would have this type of social complexity. And it was to guard our resources. It was to guard the Skeena River for us. Tsm'syen is the Skeena River. And we protected that because it was a trade corridor that went into the mountains. And the Kwakwakiwak and Vancouver Island protected Johnston Strait, didn't allow people to go. They were protecting their economy. They were protecting their trade. Tlingit, the same thing with the Chilkat and Chilkoot River system, the same thing. The Bellacoola, the Newhawk, they protected the Bellacoola River. These are areas where you cross over into mountains and you bring your trade goods. And there's archaeological evidence that indicates that this has gone on for at least 7,000 years. 7,000 years. There's archaeological evidence that we have been on this coast for 14,000 years. 14,000, that's huge. It's not 100, it's not 150, and we don't get to celebrate 14,000 years in a celebration, but we've got a significant amount of knowledge about these systems that we're working with. These are complex systems, and our social institutions were complex adaptive systems that worked with our environment. We would have, the Gitlan tribe would have ownership over a specific river and specific tributaries to that river. And we would know the timing and the variability of the fish stocks that were entering that river to spawn. And we would make sure that we did things like allow the females to get through, allow the biggest fish to get through, so that we could keep that fecundity high. We could keep the reproductive success high. And we kept track of which streams were going to be producing which stocks at what time. And we also typically fished on a tidal cycle. It's known as a tidal pulse fishing. Steve Langdon has produced information on the salmon up in the Tlingit territories, and I looked at the Ulukan in my dissertation as well. And we have 4 tides on this coast that are pretty high. They get up to be about 24 feet in height. But the highest high tide, mean high water tide, is when fish can escape and get up through the rivers to their spawning grounds. Then there's a mean higher high water. So the fish are kind of relaxing a little bit. And there's a mean lower low water. And that's, the tide has gone out a little bit more. And then there's a mean lower low water, the lowest. And at that particular point in time, fish would become entrained in what's known as stone traps. And these are massive devices that are built as walls, as wall structures along rivers, at the river mouth and in the estuary itself, to capture salmon. It was a very efficient passive technology. And when the water tide came in, then the fish swam up and escaped. So there was nothing that was ghost fishing in these systems. They were used in a way that allowed people to take what was needed, but it wasn't just a subsistence value. We don't have that word in any of our languages, subsistence. We think of these resources as gifts from creation or treasures or wealth. We've always known our way of life as wealth, and that's our cosmology. That's what we would like to see again. We would like to participate actively in the stewardship that these resources need. We need to make sure that we get some of those very big fish up to the spawning grounds. We need to make sure we're getting the females over on West Coast Vancouver Island, particularly for Chinook. Because when we have these activities that are engaged and producing hopefully some results, if we can get to do this soon, then we're going to be able to see some results for southern resident killer whales. And we're going to be able to see results for the ecosystem benefits that salmon provide, including providing nutrients into the forest. Marine-derived nitrogen comes from salmon and is delivered to our forest. Just like a farmer is going to put nitrogen on his fields, every year we've got this pulse of nitrogen that goes into our forests. And it's no wonder we have monumental trees, these enormous cedar trees and spruce trees and Douglas fir on this coast. It's because salmon play a role. These are all connected.
Thank you. And what do you think that the role ought to be for Aboriginal knowledge then in managing these issues and these stuffs?
That's an interesting question. The wild salmon policy is a very useful tool. It's one of the tools that Brian mentioned we have in our toolbox. And we do have many tools in our toolbox. We've got the legislation. The problem is that metaphorically we don't have the laborers to actually build something. And we often end up in this reactive mode. I'm distracted, but I'll get back to your question in just a minute. The $26 million Cohen Commission was a reactive response by government, and that followed the same year that we concluded the BC Pacific Salmon Forum. We were given $2.5 million by the province, and we leveraged more, and we ended up with $3 million in doing research to answer the questions that were posed to us. And so that's a lot of money. The research that we're talking about that needs to be done is expensive. It's very expensive. And so when the Cohen Commission came out, $26 million was spent in a knee-jerk reaction that we, from our world looking at the science and salmon and et cetera, were thinking we could use that for other purposes. And probably all of us were considering what the results of that commission might be. So we do have these tools, and there is attempts in these tools to try and improve the Aboriginal Canadian relationship, but we're not seeing actions yet. And the wild salmon policy is a good example of a suggestion to do something to consider Aboriginal knowledge or integrate Aboriginal knowledge. But we've had challenges in exchanging information in the past. We told people that arrived here on this coast where salmon spawn. We told them about the different species. We told them when the run timing is. So we told them these things, and then they went fishing, right? And they kept fishing and kept fishing and kept fishing. And so we're a little reluctant to engage in exchange of our knowledge. We've got some unresolved issues here in Canada for Aboriginal people. They're significant. And the Prime Minister is made some statements in regard to improving the relationship, but we have a long ways to go. Right now, there are 4 pieces of legislation that will impact this coast as well, the Fisheries Act in particular, but the Navigation Protection Act, 2 pieces of legislation. Here's an opportunity to make a difference in that Aboriginal relationship. That, and also modernizing the National Energy Board and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Those 4 pieces of legislation, we're trying to engage Canada at that high level to make sure that we're capitalizing on these statements that are being made. We want to make sure that if the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People is actually abided by Canada, what does it mean for us? And we don't even use the word Indigenous for ourselves for the most part. That means poor and suffering when you look at the etymology and where that word comes from. We didn't select that word. So when is the conversation going to begin with Aboriginal people about what it's going to take to actually improve that Aboriginal-federal relationship? So I think we have a lot of work to do. I'm hoping that I can play a significant part in putting together some of these pieces so that we have a better, more robust picture for returning some resiliency to the way that we use our environment.
Okay, thank you. So we've had a chance to hear the perspectives of our four panelists and got a good sense of kind of where their minds are on some of these issues. And what I'd like to do now is open it up to the audience to ask any questions of any of the four panelists or all the four panelists. And what I'd like to ask of the panelists is that you repeat the question. So when the question is asked, if you could repeat the question before you answer it, that would be great, because we do have folks online as well who need to be able to hear the questions too. So thank you for that. So do we have any specific questions from the audience? Yeah. So it's difficult. What you're saying, just to kind of try and paraphrase, is it's difficult as a single individual to feel like you're able to really make much of a difference. And what you're looking for are there any tools that you can use as a teacher and in the rest of your life to as you said, lock arms with others and create more of an impact? So what tools do you think we have that we can offer?
Yep, I'll take that first. The tools that I think we can offer are, particularly with First Nations students, but also with other students as well, is a cultural immersion. A cultural immersion is important for particularly for Aboriginal students. And we see an increase in cultural immersion in some of our isolated communities. They're doing a much better job at bringing the children out into the lands with elders and with practices. I'm working on a salmon forest project right now up on the Central Coast. And the very first response was, we want to have our youth program engaged in this as we're doing the research. And so that they have that hands-on, they have that connection. It's a reconnection, really. We did go through significant social change, and we're still adjusting to that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission report highlighted how devastating some of these changes are, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? So we've got to go through, and we have a role to play as well, Aboriginal people, and I would be interested in talking with the students as well. I do that on occasion too, and so I think there is opportunities for cultural immersion. And also an environmental immersion, if you will, so that there is a growing, momentum about what we're doing with our environment.
So I'm pretty sure I just heard an offer from Teresa to come to your school. Did anyone else hear that? Because I'm pretty sure I heard that. Okay.
I'll just add a few things from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, because, you're hitting on really that's the heart of the problem, right? How does change start and how does it grow? It starts with an individual and that. So one of the things that we try to, and it's surprising how much pushback we get on how much we put into education. So I have a real focus in the Salmon Foundation in educational programs, and we use musical training, we have books and that, and they're all for people to come out and explain salmon in their environments. We try to take them out onto streams and that. And then the other element of this is just building public awareness. I mean, an evening like this, or really this summer we supported a program in the center of Vancouver called, it's a film called Uninterrupted, all right? And if anybody, did anybody get to see it? All right, so when they first came to us 5 years ago, I thought, well, these ladies are nuts, right? And their vision was, we're gonna bring salmon to people, right? We don't have to go to the Adams River every year. So these were artists who worked with very high resolution cameras and that, and they wanted to have a live art show in Vancouver, and they projected the Adams River under the Cambie Bridge, right across, right? And it's amazing the sort of clarity they could get with the types of projection cameras that we have available now. And so this is a way of bringing the wonderment back into the people. So the mission, the stream, the flow of the salmon started with apartments around Vancouver, and they went up the Fraser River. They followed the spawning in the Adams, and they had down to the eggs. You could see the individual fish developing in the eggs, and then they had bringing them all the way back down again. It was very, very expensive. It's not something we do easily, but I mean, any feedback we've got is that it was spectacular, all right? And so we got to keep showing this now. So we did this all summer. Last Saturday night, I think it was Labor Day weekend, they had 1,200 people crammed into the area under the bridge to see this, right? So it's that sort of thing that's different and big that I think we have to start doing to get the idea out there. But it's people like yourself, starting with the kids, that I think where it all starts. All right. Or reconnect and restoration. So we spend a lot of time talking about conservation, and conservation is almost talked so much now that it's almost negative, right? Because conservation means you can't use as much. You've got to save it. You talk about restoration, it's much more positive, and it has a surprising change in pickup and that. And so we're actually now talking about not just talking about conservation, but let's restore production. So the people in the Stewart Lakes and the Upper Fraser, they used to have, when I started with salmon, they had escapements of about 250,000 sockeye. This year it was 17,000, right? So those people have not fished for, what would it be, 20 years now? All right, so they're not interested in conservation. They're interested in changing the whole attitude. And let's start bringing this back, because there has to be reasons. And we've obviously generated it. Well, you know, that's a good point to really maybe for the group to respond to, because all I can do is do the best I do to get the information out there, all right? If it's spectacular and it gets good responses, then that's good, because people are going to have that interest. But it does take people to carry it on, right? We're going to be reliant on 1 or 2 city council people to allow us to do it again next year. If they go on and do something else, the whole thing could just drop. Right, so we've got to sustain that momentum once you get it there.
We have another question or a comment there. the teacher really can become the multiplier in that, for sure.
Eric, can I just give one extra example of that? It's
Sure.
sort of different scale, more to the climate change. One of the other things the Salmon Foundation funds are rain gardens at public schools, right? And so we're trying to get the point across about how we manage water in an urban environment. And so you don't just let it run off into the drain. So we actually build rain gardens where you can grow different food items if you want. Or if you have a pond around or you have a stream, then we'll do restoration projects with the school in that area. So right on their own area, they can see how you can change that environment. And there's lots of community volunteer groups that will work with the schools. The 345 community organizations that work for Pacific Salmon in BC, right? So they're probably right in your area, and you know, if you send us where you are, we can probably tell you exactly who to contact.
Okay. All right. Do we have any other questions or comments for any of the panelists? Yeah. So how is toxicity and pollution monitored and screened? Is that essentially the question? The food that we're harvesting. Juan José, is that something you want to tackle?
Yeah, well, there are guidelines. We have consumption guidelines at the Canadian level, depending on what kind of contaminants. And also there are international guidelines. I will give you an example. For example, mercury. Mercury is a global pollutant. It's everywhere. It's also natural, but most of the mercury that we see today is coming from anthropogenic source. That means it's human-made, coming from different activities like fossil fuel, coal burning, or other kind of activities. So at the international level, we see, for example, that safe limits might be 0.5 or 1 milligram per kilogram. That means part per million, ppm, right? So that's, for example, a threshold, which means that if you eat seafood above that level, that means can impact your nervous system or your immune system, right? So that's an example, for example, for mercury. Another example, for example, PCBs. Is also one of the classic legacy persistent organic pollutants that are in the environment. And remember that PCBs are PBT, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So 3 letters that mean something for not only for conservation of wildlife, but also humans. And PCB can really affect the immune system. That means that make you more susceptible to be affected by diseases, right? So there is I am not gonna talk about the human health, but there is a tissue residue guidelines that was generated by actually researchers from UBEC, and in that research was involved Dr. Ross. They say that 1.3 part per million is a safe level for an organism to don't be affected by PCBs. This is the level that shouldn't be exceeded so that it won't suffer any impairment in the immune system and in the endocrine system, the system that regulate the hormones, for example, in the environment. So we can talk a lot about contaminants in the environment. There are many contaminants. So we, at the Canadian level, we have the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA. So CEPA is supposed to be a preventive, precautionary, and sustainable development act. The question is whether or not it's applying the reality is a question that the government should really answer, right? So I think the way to look at this is being preventive, precautionary. Don't wait until something is released to the environment, but instead try to avoid that go to our ocean. We assume in the last century, we assume that the ocean is gonna dilute the pollution, that the solution for pollution was dilution, and that's not the case. Why? Because we have this PBT substance that bio-amplify and bioaccumulate in organisms and in food webs, right? The best example is PCBs, DDT, and many other contaminants are emerging today. Now we have a new kind of black contaminants, the microplastic, which is part of a much bigger problem in our ocean.
So I guess the question there, going back to your original question, is, you know, I can buy ocean-wide seafood and know that it's a sustainably sourced product, but how do I know that the seafood that I'm eating is safe?
Well, yeah, there are institutions that monitor the seafood, right? And that depends on funding, right? And that depends also on have a good analytical tools, good laboratory that are certified to try to analyze, to measure the level of contaminant. And that's not an easy task, right? But to tell you that one sample costs $1,000 per sample to measure, for example, all the saga of contaminant that we have, that we can find in a kind of 1 gram of lipid, right? So basically we are talking about cocktails of contaminant that basically in the blubber, for example, of a whale or in the tissue of a fish. So Health Canada is monitoring, for example, some contaminant like cesium-137. Cesium is a radionuclide, radioisotope that is released when we have nuclear accident like Fukushima. For example, we know today that the levels are very, very low levels. That's one of the, for example, tasks that the government has undertaken. Universities, many universities in the world do research. Here in our backyard, we have Simon Fraser University, University of British Columbia, other university, UBEC, that conduct monitoring, and they use environmental indicators or biological indicators like marine mammals, like the orca, like the harbor seal, even fish, like salmon, to try to tell us how contaminated is our environment. They are like the sentinels of the environment to tell whether the level are above or below to certain safe limit or level in the environment.
Thanks. Yeah, and then we'll come to you. So, Dalal, you want to try and take that one?
Okay.
Okay. So repeating the question, basically what you're saying is that you're having a little trouble with this idea of sustainability, and you know, how is it really defined? If a fishery can be up 1 year and down the next year, how can you have something that is considered truly sustainable? Is that a fair paraphrase? Okay. Pardon me? Okay, so we're in a crisis, and sustainability should be pretty well defined by now. Okay.
I'll just speak in terms of the Oceanwide Seafood Program here. We define sustainable based on 3 criteria. So the first one is the health and resilience of a fishery stock. The second is whether there's effective management in place. And then the third is whether the fishing practices have impacts on the surrounding habitat and species. And we think that those 3 components kind of capture the widest meaning of sustainability there could be in terms of fisheries, but you know, also recognize there's different components that are not accounted for, like health, or you know, even ghost gear explicitly is not accounted for. But it's definitely in terms of educating consumers about their options, going with an ocean-wide recommended species is more sustainable than one that's not.
Well, it's a great question, and I have many times recently said that I think sustainability is badly overused and poorly understood. Very much like conservation. And I think the First Nations to me have a better sense of sustainability because they all talk about 7 generations, right? So you can't talk about sustainability unless we talk about a time frame, right? And so we've given an example here where I agree is definitely criteria for a sustainable fishery. But what does it mean when we talk about sustainable aquaculture, all right? I don't even get that. I mean, as a Canadian involved with wild salmon, I don't care if you're able to sustain your aquaculture company. That's not the point. The point is that you can have aquaculture and sustained wild Pacific salmon. Well, if you put that in the context of a community in the Strait of Georgia or a First Nation in Johnstone Strait, it's totally different because it's the time frame that we're talking about, right? So we have to be really accurate. Now, your idea about random variation, I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about the extent of the variation we're seeing, but sustainability has to be over the long term. We can't avoid annual variation. That's reality. And so if we're finding that it's trending downward over time and we still have lots of variation, then it's not sustainable, right? And then we'd have to look back at what's going on. And to be perfectly honest, until we get money back into salmon monitoring programs right now, many of the populations, you couldn't tell if it's sustainable or not, right? So one of the things under climate change that I emphasize every time I get to speak these days is you have to put money back into monitoring, and you have to do monitoring well, right? One of the things is with the big variation that we see, there are populations that will be really productive and we're not even going to fish them. So the people in that area won't have any benefit from those big spikes because we're not there fast enough to respond, right? So really a lot of this in terms of how the environment is going, whether you're talking about sustainability, we need to define it in a way that we can all agree. But the other is we have to simply put more money into monitoring so we can respond correctly. Sometimes it'll be good, sometimes it'll be bad.
Eric, can I just follow up real quickly? One more thing. I agree with you. We are in crisis. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, as we're working towards rebuilding and restoring things, that there are some things that are still on the verge, on the precipice of being absolutely lost. I'm wearing earrings that are made of abalone shells, and they're not recovering. I bought them somewhere else. But we're having a really difficult time with some of these species that are already at ready to drop off the edge. And that indicates that the entire ecosystems are out of balance. And when we think about the 7 generations, typically what we're also thinking about is the 7 generations before us. We're bringing the history with us, and we are the balance of the next 7 generations. So what we do now is going to affect those 7 generations ahead. So it's actually 14 generations that we're talking about, right? So it's knowing where we've been to know where we're going in the future. And right now, we've got to be cognizant of the fact that we're starting at a point where we're getting an improved awareness of what's going on, but we're also at a point where the species abundances are not where they could be if we can make the changes that we need to make. I'll start first because I'm sure you have a very thorough answer. I think that Streamkeepers are they're a great opportunity to engage, like I had mentioned earlier, in the cultural immersion and the environmental immersion, and I'm fully supportive of those. Unfortunately, they rely on volunteerism. We've got this culture of volunteerism around our salmon streams, and it's a real difficult battle because you can't keep up the consistency with that. I mean, people only have so much time that they can donate in their lives. We've got very busy schedules and going to school and working and all of this stuff. So I think our reliance on volunteerism has actually cost us the ability to steward the streams appropriately. And I also think that there's an opportunity for First Nations to become heavily engaged in the way that they have been in the past. If they're provided a boost with their capacity so they have the capability. It's not just throwing, $10,000 at a small community for them to fill out reports. We're talking about substantive development in programs that are enduring and long-term to steward the resources. And as far as the salmon enhancement activities go, the salmon ranching is up in Alaska, very prominent, as you know, and they base all of their fisheries on what they're ranching. And it has some negative impacts on some of our far north migrating stocks as well. So there's challenges at many levels. I think there is a need to have some juvenile salmon net pen protection in the estuary because we've got such poor early marine survival in salmon right now that it is something that should be investigated. But I'm thinking in terms of pragmatically, feasibility, making sure that we're not just going to do it so that we've got a make work project, but that we anticipate some substantive benefits from it, some results, and not just a one-off project for those that might be successful. And that requires the commitment of the governments that are responsible for making sure that our resources are taken care of, to put the dollar where their mouth is, right? They've got to step up to the plate. There's got to be commitments that are made. First Nations people have been advocating for a very long time that we are in our environments. We are interested in the stewardship, the monitoring, all of the activity that's necessary. We just need some capacity and some capability to do that. It took quite a bit to get me up to a PhD. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but right now I think we're at 64% or 63% of our high school students are graduating. So that's up from 47%. The national average is 54%. And so we've got a little step up, but we don't have the programs in college yet for resources. At any level, whether it's fisheries or whether it's forestry, we do not have the incentivized programs to attract Aboriginal students, and that makes it difficult. So that is one of the hindrance that we have in creating our capacity and capability. So I'm going to let you go with the rest of that.
Fix it?
Yeah.
Probably I should start with, not everybody's probably aware of how you use that sort of jargon, right? So ocean ranching is, when we talk about that as opposed to our hatcheries, ocean ranching is normally considered to be sort of commercial scale, large, and so you do a little bit of early rearing, normally in large net pens, and then you release them to the ocean. So basically it's the concept of you're ranching the ocean, right? Well, all the wild salmon do that as well, of course, and that, but there isn't any question that we're now seeing evidence of competition of these very, very large ocean ranching programs in the state of Alaska having effects on other people's fish, typically sockeye salmon, and there's some evidence for, I think it's really kind of stretched it. Well, you do see competition with steelhead of all things, right? Steelhead are a distant migrant fish. They're amongst the least abundant, and they have a long period of residence in the ocean. So ocean ranching is big scale, largely commercial, and a lot of it is done with private investment, right? But in Alaska, there's also a shared government and private. Salmon enhancement is really more what Canada does, and there are many scales of this. a spawning channel can be very large and produces a lot of juveniles, but it's relatively small production in terms of large-scale ocean ranching. Our major hatcheries do not use the species that are super abundant. We are very focused into Chinook and coho salmon, some chum and then less pink, and no sockeye, zero sockeye in hatcheries. They're all in spawning channels. So these are very different types of ways of working with increasing the number that's available for communities and so on. The last one in terms of Streamkeepers, when I said that we had 345 groups that work with the Pacific Salmon Foundation, they may well be members of the Streamkeeper Federation of BC, and that's something that grew out of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans years ago, or they might be all in community volunteerism, just like Teresa described. To me, that community volunteerism is very important because it's great in getting that educational element out there. A lot of these young people that go out with the grandparents, they're doing exactly what you were talking about in your school. They're learning about salmon and they're seeing the animals. They're seeing all the life in the stream and what you have to protect. They're seeing how you restore the riparian habitat along the streams. So these Streamkeeper groups are very, very important. Personally, I think that it's been a big error on the Pacific Salmon Foundation side to not engage more with First Nations. There's actually a reason for that that's set in our agreement with the federal government, but I'm not going to get into that stuff. All right, so these are all scales of what we can do. And we've drawn very hard lines on what we allow in Canada. Now, we're actually working with the Awikano people in Rivers Inlet right now. We have a very small hatchery, and we're working with them on the development of their treaty agreement. I think having a small-scale ocean ranching for something like summer chum would be ideal to bring some economic opportunity to that community. It's going to have essentially no risk locally because you can scale it to the populations around. But right now, there's a policy in Canada of zero ocean ranching in Canada, right? But we have hatcheries, which do the exact same thing, but they're federally controlled and provincially controlled. So we're going to have to open up thinking about this a little bit, and particularly under climate change, because as we said, the natural populations cannot be expected to have the productivity that they've had in the past. And of course, climate change is going to progress from the south to the north, right? We're all talking about global change. The biggest thermal change will be in the Arctic, right? But we're in that sort of mid-range. So what we're going to see, and why I said water temperature is the most important, we're going to see big changes in that. And so if we lost the Fraser sockeye, then we can't compensate. We cannot make that up, right? That's our single biggest resource for Pacific salmon. The only thing we could do would be compensate by actually being more open to some things like ocean ranching, right? But ocean ranching for Chinook and coho or sockeye are not going to work. You can probably do it for pink and chum and that, but for the others, it's going to be a long slug. You have to sustain the natural habitats for those, right? Yeah, the answer is yes. There's actually a Genome Canada and there's a Genome BC research program, one of which I'm involved with, looking at genetic diversity in coho throughout southern BC. And you're looking for these sorts of differences in the populations. One of the other things we haven't touched on is pathogens. And as we change the thermal regimes in BC, you're going to see new bugs. And our salmon in our area are not going to be resistant to them. So that's another thing that's going to be affected. And so we're actually looking already at the tolerance of BC salmon to new pathogens. And so that's something that's similar to what you're saying. You're looking for genetic opportunities, but genetic selection is also something that's taboo in hatcheries, right? And so Teresa talked about large Chinook. The single biggest complaint and change that I hear from people in BC is where have all the big Chinook gone? Right, and so we're actually now looking at genetically doing reverse selection, directed selection, like agriculture. So in your hatcheries, try and shift the body size and age structure of the Chinook back to where they were. You can do that, right? But the important thing is that you then have to see that transferred into the wild populations.
Okay. And you've got a question or a comment?
Yeah, no, not glaciers. Forget about glaciers. Anything in the ice for that long is not going to be alive.
Brian,
Right,
Brian, we should
so-
repeat the question real quick.
I'm not sure. Let me think about the question. So we were talking about the pathogens and where they're coming from, and is it because it's warmer? Far away, local. It's actually both. So a gradual warming, we see redistribution of pathogens that are in the United States. One of the most problematic for us is a virus called IHN, which is actually in most sockeye. But the heart of IHN was in the Columbia Basin, right? And so we will see a gradual shift of these bugs north, right? The other part of long distance, though, could be the greatest single risk in salmon aquaculture is if you brought in an exotic bug that our salmon have no tolerance of. And when you have heard in the media about major losses in Chile or in Scotland and that, it's because of a virus that was in Norway originally called ISA, and it's tolerated by salmon until it mutates, and then it becomes highly virulent. It was never in Chile, but it was moved there through the industry, and then it broke out. So you have to be very, very careful that we're not too complacent about, we're okay, we haven't seen it in BC. They never saw it in Chile, right? So you have to have very rigorous standards about what you're exposing the salmon to. Now that should be very manageable. That's unusual. But we are going to see a natural distribution, a redistribution of parasites in particular, viruses, bacteria, fungi, even types of plants, algae that we're seeing, diatoms, yeah. All of this is going to shift.
And those
Yeah,
issues are not specific to salmon either.
The famous release in Puget Sound. Well, this is a problem that's been in BC for years. When I was in government, we had something called the Atlantic Salmon Watch, because when the aquaculture industry was developing in BC, we had millions of fish released because they didn't know how to secure the pens particularly well in some currents and that. And so the whole issue of Atlantic salmon getting into BC ecosystems has been around for 30 years. Atlantic salmon do very poorly compared to Pacific salmon. They cannot interbreed. Have different chromosomes numbers, so all the concern about intermating is false. They can disrupt spawning. They may try to interject their sperm or whatever and that, and maybe a Pacific salmon will try to mate with an Atlantic salmon female, but it will not persist. They cannot reproduce, right? So what you're really talking about is disruption on a spawning ground, and they simply won't be in enough abundance of this. So what you're likely going to see, you're hearing now that there's a movement away, and they're spreading out and people are catching them in other localities. As they mature, they will actually likely go back to Puget Sound, because salmon do this homing normally. And there's lots of experience where you have releases and you'll see fish coming back after. They mill around the area they're aware of, but there's no place to spawn. And so then they start to spread out and they look for freshwater streams, right? And so they'll distribute out into fairly small numbers. In the long term, that release will have really no effect anywhere unless they carried a disease, which we were assured is that they do not. But now as we're seeing them, they do, right? So this is something that I don't know what it is yet, so I can't speculate on it. I mean, lots of people that sport fish, you'll find an ulcer on a fish sometime, right? Well, fish are in the wild environment. They do get bacteria and viruses, right? It doesn't mean that they're a real danger to our natural populations. So you'll hear about this for another year, and it'll be gone, and nothing will happen, right? And we've only learned that because we've had millions and millions of fish, Atlantic salmon, escape in BC over the years, and there is no natural population. You will hear people say that there's no monitoring, so how do we know that? Well, we spent a lot of time monitoring, never found anything, so we stopped wasting our time. That's what it comes to. So it's unfortunate. It was a very poorly managed farm. I was surprised at the age of the farm just looking at it. If you went and saw a Canadian farm, it would look like, I don't know, some brand new skyscraper compared to a cottage, right? They're just not like that anymore. That was a very, very poorly maintained facility.
Okay, we have just a few more minutes, so I want to make sure if we have other questions or comments. Yeah. So are there opportunities for DFO to do partnering with First Nations, and what kind of monitoring needs to be done?
Well, I'll get this back to Teresa in a second, but we're doing exactly what you just said now. So DFO is getting new money, and you keep seeing this in the media, the Ocean Protection Plan money, and there's up to $1 billion coming to BC. It's the largest federal grant out here ever over 5 years. But that money is not going into monitoring, right? It's going into all sorts of other activities, right? Many of them worthwhile, but I'm just saying they're just not monitoring. So as a commissioner for Canada, and Teresa's involved with the Salmon Treaty as well, as we were trying to negotiate the new agreement, we were being actually told by the United States that we had to invest more, or they weren't going to proceed in discussing this stuff. So the commissioners for Canada wrote the minister a note at Christmas pointing out that the monitoring is simply inadequate and has to be resolved, and that. So what we've gone to now is a number of commissioners plus the Pacific Salmon Foundation, and working with the First Nations, are putting together what we've simply called, for simplicity, a new salmon network. And what it is a partnership with First Nations, because they know the salmon populations in their areas, right? So, and Teresa mentioned the capacity element. So we need a dedicated fund to sustain that capacity, and that gets to things like potentially ocean ranching or restoration. And really the long-term goal is to put everybody together into a much more efficient and comprehensive monitoring program so we understand what's going on in salmon. But it would be done in full collaboration with the First Nations in that. So DFO will still have an oversight role, because they are the group that would have to talk between governments of Canada and the United States. But the people that would do the work and would really improve the system is networking with the First Nations. And then PSF has a piece of software where we could offer to integrate all the data on an annual basis and that. But really what it is about all working together for a better outcome.
The other consideration is that there are different levels of monitoring. So when we're saying monitoring, from our view, we might mean a whole bunch of different things, right? One of the ways that we monitor the abundance of Chinook salmon is through a coded wire tag program. We put a little tag inside the snout of a Chinook juvenile, and we see where they are caught or whether they escape to the ground. So we're talking about monitoring an abundance there, but we also monitor, we need to monitor the survival of the juveniles that are hatching, and we need to monitor the habitat. We need to make sure that we've got adequate protection of the streams, the riparian areas, and the forests that contribute to the riparian areas. We need to make sure that the integrity of the functions of that ecosystem work. So there's another level of monitoring as well. Plus, we also have to monitor our harvest impact. And this is where things get really dicey for us, because we've got largely 4 sectors, you could call it, if you include the non-government organizations as a sector. But we have the recreational, the commercial, and the First Nations, right, or the Aboriginal fisheries. And the way that these are regulated there's differences in the regulation procedure. So the fishing has to be monitored too, and we haven't quite figured that out. We're still working on monitoring and compliance. There's an organization that is evolved that is trying to improve relationships between sectors and figuring out how best to monitor the harvest impact. But we're still a ways off, and it's not going to be easy solutions by any measure. And it's going to be helpful. This is one of the opportunities that we have in Parliament reviewing the Fisheries Act and restoring the habitat protections again. This is an opportunity to make sure we've got mechanisms put into that toolbox to build some of these co-management arrangements as well, and for all of these different levels of monitoring. And there also needs to be a will or a commitment from the sectors to support and advocate for the other sector. And this, we're talking decades of acrimony. I mean, I myself am guilty of it too. When, you know, we get a memo from DFO on what we can't do, my first response is, oh, what are the sporties doing? You know, do they have to comply with this? So, and it's the same thing back and forth. But we need to find a better way to account for what we're doing in harvest impacts on our fish, or we're going to lose them. All the sectors across the board are going to lose them.
Sounds like we have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
And on that note, we've got just about 2 minutes, and what I'd like to do, the nice thing is the moderator is I get to decide if I get to ask a question, and now's my chance. And that is simply to just go one at a time and very briefly to say what you think the take-home message needs to be from this conversation. And if you can keep it brief, that'd be great, because we only have a couple minutes.
Well, I think the message I give people most often is climate change isn't coming, it's here. It's here in a smaller scale than it's going to be, and if you want to manage for climate change, you start acting now, not later. And so we have to start being deniers and start redefine sustainability, make a long-term commitment, and get busy now.
I agree. Can I just pass it? No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it would be brief.
I know, that would be brief. I think what we also see here is that there obviously is a lot of work that is engaged in what we've been discussing here, right? There's definitely 4 perspectives here, but there's many others that are involved as well. And I think it's helpful when we have an opportunity to communicate some of this stuff, and it helps, you know, improve that advocacy role when you get back into your homes and your communities, and then we can, you know, start networking in this expansion of our knowledge, and hopefully we can start affecting governments and how governments are interacting and making sure that they understand what the constituents are asking for, right, in their representation of us as Canadians. So I think one of the benefits that we have is this opportunity to engage in exchange that otherwise we don't have an opportunity at a coffee shop or over the water fountain. Thank you.
I would just add that it sounds like the impacts of these problems are now well understood, at least enough to act. And for many of these problems, solutions do exist, and it's just a matter of having the political will to implement some of those solutions.
I agree also with that. And from my perspective, I say that we need to reestablish our human connection with nature, to start acknowledge the sense of place with our children, to start saying then that we need to respect the environment, to reestablish that spiritual ecology with the bird, with the orca, with the salmon. I think it's something that is missing, and in new school program, I think they are reestablishing that sense of place. Revisit your environment. See how it has changed in the last 4 weeks or 1 month. So that's something that we need to reestablish at home. And we need to change our preference, our behavior, consume less, save more energy, consume less plastic, and take public transportation.
All right. So on that note, I will end it here, and thank you all very, very much for coming tonight. Thank you to the Ocean Canada Partnership again for co-hosting the event tonight. And we will stick around for a little bit, and you're welcome to stick around for a little bit to continue the conversation. But thank you again very much for coming out tonight.